Hi, I'm Erica from the Pancake Princess, and welcome back to my New York kitchen. Today we are tasting 9 different coconut cakes that I baked all in one day. So coconut cake is a dessert that originated in the South. It's typically a white or a yellow cake paired with a white frosting that's not necessarily coconut flavored, but it's almost always covered in the signature shredded coconut. In this bake-off, I looked at 40 recipes before narrowing it down to 9 distinctive recipes that I tested. And these had a bunch of different factors, from whole eggs to whipped egg whites, sour cream versus heavy cream versus buttermilk versus cream of coconut. One cake even has mayo, and the frostings range from a cream cheese frosting to a buttercream to a Swiss meringue buttercream to a meringue. So let's dive in. I'm gonna taste all 9 cakes and let you know my thoughts on each. King Arthur is a butter-based cake that uses egg whites that are not whipped. Instead of using coconut milk, this is the only cake that uses coconut milk powder, which they say adds the perfect amount of coconut flavor. It also uses optional coconut extract in both the cake and the frosting, which is a cream cheese frosting that once again uses that coconut milk powder. So let's try it and see if it does indeed have the perfect amount of coconut flavor. Oh my god, my mouth is so dry. Okay, overall, the coconut flavor in this cake is extremely subtle. I would say the coconut milk powder stands out a little more in the frosting. You're getting kind of like a subtle coconut flavor, but in the cake, it really just tastes like a really good vanilla cake. It's a little on the drier side, but it's still moist enough that it kind of like sticks together in your mouth. It's a little bit crumbly. You get a really nice white cake flavor from just having egg whites in the cake. Overall, I'd say really subtle coconut flavor, a great kind of cake if you want just like a nice vanilla cake that has a coconut element to it. Bravetart is a really interesting cake because she uses a lot of natural coconut products to get a lot of coconut flavor. So she uses butter and virgin coconut oil, which, because it's not refined, gives a lot of that coconut flavor, a combination of coconut flour and all-purpose flour, coconut milk, and whole eggs. She also uses a creamy coconut frosting, which is really like a coconut Swiss meringue buttercream that has a base of egg whites. She adds coconut oil again for that flavor, a little bit of cream of tartar for acidity, and turbinado sugar for a more complex sweetness. The crumb on this cake is incredible. It is so plush. It's a really kind of like tight crumb. It's fairly moist, but it just kind of like melts in your mouth. I have personal baggage when it comes to coconut flour because I made a lot of like really bad gluten-free desserts back in the day with coconut flour. So you can definitely like kind of taste that, but if you don't have that same baggage, I think it would be a really pleasant coconut flavor for most people. Moving on to the frosting, it is topped with toasted coconut, which I personally love for the depth of flavor and the kind of caramelization that it adds. And I think it pairs really well with kind of like the toasty notes from the turbinado sugar in the Swiss meringue buttercream. For those of you who know, Swiss meringue buttercream is a really light frosting. It's very silky, kind of melt in your mouth, and it's a great alternative from the kind of heavy and like really sugary American buttercreams. But if you've never had it before, it can be a little bit off-putting because it tastes very buttery and just like almost greasy because it is so light and just like egg whites combined with butter. So for those of you who know you like it, this would be an amazing cake to try. Cooking Classy uses cake flour, a mixture of butter and oil, coconut milk, and a higher proportion of egg whites to yolks, with the egg whites getting whipped in the process. I had a feeling that I would really like this cake because I love the way that cake flour gives a really fine texture to cakes. Butter and oil adds richness from the butter and a moist texture from the oil. Coconut milk adds another layer of fat to the cake, while the whipped egg whites, as much as it's a pain in the butt to whip them, add a really nice like light texture to cakes. And the frosting itself is a cream cheese frosting with a little bit of coconut extract for flavor. So let's dive in and see if it tastes as good as I hope. Sure enough, this cake has the exact kind of texture that I like. So there's kind of a tight, fine, close crumb. It's not overly dense. It still remains pretty light and airy. It does lean slightly on the drier side while still remaining plush and tender and kind of melt in your mouth. The frosting has a nice tang from the cream cheese, just very subtle coconut flavor in both the cake and the frosting. Some people said the flavor was a little bit artificial tasting, which probably comes from most of the flavor coming from the coconut extract. Overall, I feel like this is a really great kind of bakery style cake with just like a very subtle coconut flavor. This recipe is Peninsula Grill. This comes from a famous restaurant in Charleston where at the restaurant they reportedly serve a 12-layer cake. I made a 2-layer cake for tasting purposes. This cake is butter-based, made with heavy cream, whole eggs, all-purpose flour, and a tiny bit of coconut oil. There's actually 5 components to this cake. So the cake itself, frosting, a simple syrup that goes on the cake, the filling, and then a coconut creme anglaise, which I skipped because they just use that for serving at the restaurant. The filling is made from sugar, heavy cream, butter, thickened with cornstarch with coconut added back in for extra coconut flavor. This cake is extremely moist with a very kind of like coarse crumb, so it's giving a little bit of like cornbread vibes, but like overall very buttery, very rich. This cake definitely has more coconut flavor than the past cakes that we've tried because of the filling. There's shredded coconut in that, plus the toasted coconut on top, so you're getting a double dose of coconut, even though there's actually no coconut in the frosting, which is just a straight up buttercream, so just butter and sugar basically. This is a really great cake if you're looking for like a sweet, rich, decadent cake. It is very sweet. I'm curious to see if this measures up to the actual cake that they serve in the restaurant. I've never tried it, so if you've tried it, you should try this cake and let me know. Sally's Baking Addiction is another very popular coconut cake recipe. It's another butter-based recipe that uses cake flour, egg whites that are not whipped, sour cream, coconut milk, coconut extract, and shredded coconut in the batter itself. The cream cheese frosting uses just a little bit of coconut milk and coconut extract. This cake reminds me a lot of Cooking Classy. It's very plush. It is more moist than Cooking Classy, and it gives more coconut flavor because of the shredded coconut in the batter. I personally prefer Cooking Classy because I don't like the texture of coconut in the cake itself, but a lot of people do like that texture. Sally's Baking Addiction tastes almost completely neutral to me. Like, it's a very vanilla cake, aside from like when you get like a bit of shredded coconut, versus Cooking Classy I think had a little bit more coconut flavor, but also slightly more artificial. So that's kind of like the trade-off when I think about those two cakes. The frosting itself is like a sugary buttercream, super delicious, very sweet. You're getting the coconut flavor from the shredded coconut on the top. Once again, solid vanilla cake. You're mostly getting the coconut flavor from the shredded coconut in the cake, on top of the cake, but overall plush, crowd favorite, very good. Sugar Geek Show is another butter and oil based cake recipe that also uses all-purpose flour, buttermilk, coconut extract, and toasted coconut in the cake. It calls for whole eggs, but you whip the egg white separately before adding the yolks. The cream cheese buttercream uses just a little bit of coconut extract in the frosting, and it all gets topped with more toasted coconut. This cake has a really light and airy crumb. It looks shaggy and a little bit coarse, but it's actually pretty fine and fluffy. The cream cheese frosting feels tangier than some of the other cream cheese frosting, so of course it's still sugary, but like you get a little more of that cream cheese tang. Surprisingly, I'm not getting as much coconut flavor as I thought I would get from having toasted coconut both in the cake and on top, but you still get a lot of nice texture from the coconut in the cake. Again, I would rather not have that coconut in my cake, but if you like that, I think this is a great option to try, especially if you love that kind of like the caramelized toasty notes from the coconut. You get a lot of that in this cake. This recipe is by Cheryl. This is another butter-based cake that uses all-purpose flour, whole eggs, and just a hint of cardamom, and also cream of coconut, which cream of coconut and coconut cream are very different things. Cream of coconut and coconut cream are two very different things. Coconut cream is essentially like the thickened coconut milk. It's like a very dense, creamy white substance. Cream of coconut is coconut milk with a lot of sugar added in, so it's a really kind of like almost translucent, syrupy consistency. Think of it as like sweetened condensed milk. It's an ingredient that's really popular in pina coladas. This cake is very similar to Peninsula Grill in that it has a filling, a frosting, and a coconut milk soak that helps keep the cake layers moist and add back some more flavor. The frosting is a straight up buttercream, so no cream cheese, with just a little bit of coconut milk for flavor. This cake has a nice, airy, fluffy crumb, but it does air a little more on the coarser side, which I think is what happens when you use all-purpose flour. Cake flour is obviously finer, and it's going to give you that really fine close crumb texture like Cooking Classy or Sally's Baking Addiction. Whereas this, well, it's not cornbread. It leans in that direction, kind of like King Arthur. The flavor itself is more like yellow cake than white cake, which I think is what happens when you use whole eggs instead of egg whites, because the eggs not only add more of that yellow color, but they also add just kind of an eggy flavor, which you get a little bit of that warming spice from the cardamom. It's very subtle, but it kind of is a nice differentiator from the other like straight up vanilla cake. You do get a good amount of coconut flavor from the coconut in the filling, as well as on top of the frosting, which is very sweet. It's just like straight up sugar. So this is a great cake. It's very rich, very decadent. If that's what you're going for and you want just like a little bit of like a warming spice and a lot of coconut, this is a great pick. This recipe is Preppy Kitchen. This is another butter-based cake that also uses cake flour, egg whites, and he says you can use any kind of milk you have on hand, so regular milk, buttermilk, coconut milk, he says yields the best results, so that's what I used. And he also puts shredded coconut in the cake batter. The frosting is a cream cheese frosting with just a little bit of coconut extract like many others. This recipe is actually very similar to Sally's Baking Addiction, but I wanted to test this one because it uses the reverse creaming method versus Sally's uses the regular mixing method. So reverse creaming is when you start with a bowl of your dry ingredients and then you mix in the softened butter. So all of the little butter molecules are coated in the dry ingredients, which leads to a really fine and tender crumb. Sally's Baking Addiction also uses sour cream, whereas Preppy Kitchen does not, so let's see how it compares. Okay, so after trying Preppy Kitchen, I wanted to compare it to Sally's Baking Addiction because they're so similar and talk about the differences. Over here, we have Preppy Kitchen, which is really fluffy, but kind of on the drier side. And then Sally's Baking Addiction has kind of like a thicker crumb, but it's also much more moist and plush. So while the flavor on both of these is very similar because again, you have the shredded coconut mixed into both cakes, the textures actually feel quite different. Preppy Kitchen has like a little more of like a crumbly crumb, which could come from the reverse creaming, but also I think comes from not having the sour cream. And then Sally's Baking Addiction is a little more moist, plush. So I think both are excellent cakes. It just kind of depends on what your personal preference is. This recipe is the one you've all been waiting for. This is Thomas Keller, who uses all-purpose flour, coconut milk and buttermilk, coconut extract and vanilla extract, whole eggs, but the egg whites are whipped separately from the yolks, and shredded coconut in the batter. You'll notice that I didn't mention a fat because there is no butter or oil in this cake. He uses mayo as the main source of fat, which is actually just emulsified oil, egg whites, and vinegar, yet somehow manages to be one of the most disgusting substances on this planet. The frosting is an egg white meringue, so literally just a sugar syrup drizzled into egg whites topped with more coconut. I think Thomas Keller is really onto something here with the really light texture of this cake. It's light and fluffy and spongy without being at all chewy, and I think it pairs really well with the texture of the frosting because the meringue is like really foamy and light and just melts in your mouth, so texturally they pair extremely well together. Flavor-wise, I don't think a meringue is my favorite kind of frosting. There's just like not that much flavor and it just mostly tastes like sugar. And then the cake itself has kind of like a sour flavor to it, which I think comes from like a lot of the buttermilk and then maybe a little bit from the mayo because there is that vinegar mixed in. Overall, it's not a cake that I would make again, not just because I don't like mayo, but I think if you're looking for like a really fluffy, spongy, like light coconut cake that's gonna just like melt in your mouth, this is a great pick. Okay, if I had to pick my favorite cake from these 9 recipes, it would be a really close tie between Bravetart and Cooking Classy because both have that really finely textured kind of plush melt in your mouth texture. Bravetart definitely has more of that coconut flavor and kind of like a complex sweetness, but I actually prefer the more vanilla cake flavor of Cooking Classy, and I also prefer more of a cream cheese frosting. Don't really like a Swiss meringue buttercream, but that's a personal preference. Bravetart also does require a more finicky ingredient. You'll probably have to go out and buy like coconut oil, coconut flour, so for that reason, Cooking Classy is probably going to be the recipe that I return to again and again. I hope you enjoyed this review of all 9 coconut cake recipes. As you can see, there are a ton of factors that affect each of the different cakes. Let me know in the comments which looks best to you. For every bake-off, I have over 30 tasters taste and rank each of these cakes, so you can visit my blog for the full data analysis. For more bake-offs, you can visit me on Instagram at The Pancake Princess or on TikTok at pancake.princess or on my blog, and thanks for watching.